They did a very low-key, poor traditional marriage, and all the villagers laughed at them to scorn, especially the ladies he had asked out. Their marriage became a thing of mockery. In a small village called Akuruba, there lived a man named Emeka. Emeka was a simple farmer. He planted crops and cleared people's farms to survive. His family was so poor that even the poor in the village called them poor. He was the only child of Grandma and Grandpa Obi. In his entire lifetime, all Grandpa Obi had achieved was an old bicycle, which he still rides, his pride and joy, despite its rusty frame and squeaky pedals. Grandpa Obi was nearly 85 years old, but was very strong and smart and still went to the farm. He was a very poor man, but was always a cheerful old man. He believed his son wouldn't end up poor like him, even though he didn't know how. He often sang old folk songs while working, which gave him a reputation as the village's cheerful elder. Some days, Emeka would cry, looking at their very old house, its cracked walls and leaking roof, his parents, and the fact that he couldn't do anything to help their situation. The inability to change things at the moment killed him the most. He couldn't even further his education and stopped at high school, but Grandpa would encourage him and tell him he would be a great man someday. Son, just do what you're doing. Don't stain your hands. Let your conscience be pure and keep working hard. One day, it will be your turn to shine. These words kept Emeka going. Each time he felt like giving up, he remembered his father's words and had a sense of hope to continue. Son, you know there's hope in a living dog than in a dead lion. Grandpa would often ask him, and he would answer, Yes, Papa. Grandpa's voice carried a conviction that always filled Emeka's heart with determination. At the age of 28, Emeka wanted a wife, but no one wanted him. All the ladies in the village laughed at him. Can you even pay my bride price? Even though you work for a whole year, you would never come close, they would say with mocking smiles and whispers that stung like arrows. Some would call him poor and wretched and mock him, saying, Will you sell your father's old bicycle to pay my bride price? These taunts became a bitter refrain in his daily life. He couldn't have a girlfriend because no one wanted to date him. One day, while returning from the farm, he met a very beautiful woman from Ogbana. She was an orphan. She didn't have friends and was also the only child of her late parents. She had nothing but an old sewing machine that she had inherited from her late mother. With it, she mended people's clothes to survive, as she also fed from their small farm. Her sewing machine, though rusty, was her most treasured possession. Though Emeka was from a poor home, Ada's case was worse than his. They quickly became friends as they had both been isolated. Finally, seeing someone they could talk to was a relief. Emeka quickly asked Ada to marry him. I want to see your relatives, he said. But Ada said, I don't have any relatives that I know of. It has always been me and my parents before they passed on. I have an elderly couple who lives close to my house. They are like my parents. They've really been encouraging. I'll talk to them to stand for me as my parents. Oh, that's fine, Emeka said, nodding with a smile that spoke of his growing affection. So, they did a very low-key, poor traditional marriage, and all the villagers laughed at them to scorn, especially the ladies he had asked out. Their marriage became a thing of mockery. People would say they can only marry each other. They are perfect. Poverty plus poverty equals abject poverty, and they would laugh, their voices echoing in the dusty village paths. Emeka and Ada didn't care. They were happy. Whether people called them names, it didn't bother them. What mattered to them was that they were married and happy with each other. They were always together, going to the farm and market together, often laughing and sharing dreams for the future. Some elderly villagers admired their love, but those young women kept humiliating and mocking them. One sunny day, Emeka was weeding his farm as usual. He was working very hard when he encountered a strong tree with very, very deep roots. He tried to pull the tree out while weeding, but he couldn't. Emeka decided to dig around the roots. He dug and dug. His hands blistered and his shirt soaked with sweat. But it seemed the roots went deeper and deeper. He was tired, but something inside said to him, "Keep digging." So Emeka kept digging. He saw something shining from the roots. He kept digging and found a big shiny diamond. He quickly covered it with clothes and put it inside his stool bag. Then he pulled out the tree and ran home, his heart pounding with excitement. Emeka ran straight to his father. Emeka showed the diamond to his father. His father's eyes widened in shock and happiness. "Do you know what this is, son?" "It's a diamond," his father said, "but we must not tell anyone. Let it remain within the walls of this house." "Son, do you know what this means? This is a fortune if we sell it." Emeka didn't really know the worth of the diamond, but Grandpa knew. Grandpa's hands trembled as he held the stone, a symbol of hope for their family. "Very early tomorrow morning, we're going to the city to see my friend Mr. Chidi, who's a goldsmith. He will help us check if it's a real diamond or not. Chidi is a good man, and he won't cheat us." That night, Grandpa called Mr. Chidi and explained everything to him, and they arranged to meet the next day. Early the next morning, Emeka and his father set out for the city. When Mr. Chidi saw the diamond, he screamed, "This is worth billions!" They all screamed in excitement, their voices filling the small workshop. Mr. Chidi said, "I know a very rich man who's into buying and selling pure gold, diamonds, and all manner of precious stones. He'll buy it." That night, Emeka and Grandpa Obi stayed in Mr. Chidi's house. They spent the night discussing and making plans, their excitement barely contained. The next day, they went to the rich man's house. The rich man was very happy when he saw the diamond. He knew it was a real one, and so he bought the diamond quickly and paid them a huge amount of money. Emeka and his family became billionaires in one day. With the help of Mr. Chidi, they bought a beautiful house in the city. Emeka went back to the village to bring his wife and mother to their new home in the city. Ada was sent to a big fashion school in the city. After 1 year and 6 months, she graduated as the best student and started her own fashion house. Many apprentices came to learn from her. Emeka also started a furniture business. He had always loved the furniture business, but he never had the money to start it. Now he was very successful at it. One day, Emeka's father said to him, "My son, we are old and not used to this city life. We want to go back to our village and live in our house. That's where we belong, and that's where we want to be buried. You and your wife can stay in the city. But please, when we join our ancestors, don't abandon the village. Visit the house with your children, don't isolate it." Emeka replied, "I've heard you, Papa, But you're not going back to that old house. Give me 3 months so we can transform the house. The building started, and the villagers were surprised. Nobody knew what was happening. In 3 months, Emeka built a beautiful mansion in the village for his parents. When they arrived in the village, they came in a very beautiful jeep. The entire village was in awe. The maidens who had mocked Emeka shouted in shock and regret. Che, it's not good to write anybody off, they said. God can change anybody. Emeka and his wife spent a week with his parents in the village before returning to the city. They took good care of Grandpa and Grandma, sending them a weekly allowance. His parents never worked again and lived happily. 5 years later, they died peacefully at a good old age. As they had promised, Emeka and his family visited the village every year, especially during Christmas. They employed someone to take care of the house at the village, and so they lived. Emeka's journey teaches us to never judge anyone by their current situation. Life can humble those who mock and uplift those who persevere. Today's struggles may lead to tomorrow's triumphs if we remain resilient and hopeful. Mockery only reflects a lack of understanding of life's transformative power. Treat everyone with respect because no one's destiny is fixed. Trust that hard work and faith can turn any story around. Thank you for watching my channel. Stay hopeful and keep believing. Once upon a time, 5 young women, all dressed in their NIS uniforms, were deployed to an African village named Oreo. The village was a wonder. The air smelled of ripe fruits, the trees danced in the breeze, and the hills stood like giant gods watching over the land. The villagers welcomed the Corpers with wide smiles, bringing gifts of yam, plantain, and cloth. The Corpers felt like queens. The villagers told them, "You are welcome here, but remember, our culture is sacred. Respect our ways, and you will live in peace." The king, a wise man with a beard as white as cotton, invited them to his palace. The grand mud palace, decorated with carved patterns of ancestral stories, was the pride of Oreo. He sat on his throne, surrounded by elders. His voice was strong, like thunder before rain. "My daughters," he said, "this is a land of rules. Obey them, and you will be safe. But one thing you must never do: never enter the forbidden forest. That place is not for humans, it is sacred." The Corpers nodded, their faces serious. But as soon as they left the palace, they whispered among themselves. "Do you believe those stories about the forest, Amara?" the leader of the group asked. Another Corper, Ifoma, rolled her eyes. "It's just to scare us. Every village has tales like this." That night, they were shown their new home, a cozy mud house near the village square. The scent of freshly cut firewood lingered in the air. The villagers treated them like royalty. Food was brought to their doorstep, and the people greeted them with respect. As the moon climbed the sky, the Corpers gathered outside the house, their faces lit by the silver light. They could hear villagers laughing and singing in the distance, the sound blending with the soft chirping of crickets. "This place is beautiful," Amara said, looking around. But deep in her heart, the king's words echoed. "The forbidden forest," "the forbidden forest." What could be so dangerous about a forest? The night passed peacefully, but little did they know their curiosity would soon lead them down a path they could never return from. The moon was round and bright, hanging in the sky like a golden calabash. The village square buzzed with excitement as people gathered to hear the night tale. The corpers, dressed in their night wrappers, sat among the villagers, their faces glowing with curiosity. The air was warm, but the stories made their skin tingle like cold water running down their backs. Nearby, a bonfire crackled softly, sending sparks spiraling into the dark sky. A little girl, no older than 10, stepped forward. Her name was Enkim, and her voice was small but strong. Tonight, she began, I will tell you about the forbidden forest. The crowd leaned in closer, the corpers included. Ankim's eyes sparkled like stars as she spoke. The forest is alive, she said. It has eyes that see everything. If you go deep into it, you will find a tree bigger than a house. If you touch it, the tree will take you back to the entrance. But those who go too far never come back the same. The villagers nodded, murmuring in agreement. But the corpers exchanged glances, their minds spinning with curiosity. That's not all, Enkem continued. Some say they've seen creatures, headless men, women with glowing eyes, and spirits who sing songs that make you forget your name. The villagers shuddered, but Amara, the leader of the corpers, smiled. Her smile was small, like the first crack in an egg. What nonsense, she whispered to her team. After the tale, the villagers clapped and began to leave, but the corpers stayed behind, their hearts racing. That was just a story to scare us, Amara said, her voice firm. Ifoma frowned. But what if it's real? The king warned us. Amara laughed softly, her voice like a songbird mocking the storm. Think about it, she said. If the forest is so dangerous, why hasn't anyone seen these creatures outside it? They're just trying to keep us away from something. The others hesitated, but Amara's words were like a spark in dry grass. One by one, they nodded. Well, we'll go in the morning, Amara decided. Just a quick look. No one will even know. The night felt longer than usual. As they lay in bed, their minds were filled with thoughts of the forest. The corpers didn't know it yet, but their footsteps were already echoing in a place they weren't meant to tread. Time passed, and the corpers became part of the village. They taught in the school, supervised the king's farms, and lived peacefully among the people. They no longer spoke about the forbidden forest. The villagers adored them, and the corpers enjoyed their stay. Days turned to months, and soon it was almost a year since they arrived. With just 1 week left before their service was over, Amara sat under the big tree near their quarters, lost in thought. The shade of the tree was cool, and its roots sprawled like veins over the dry earth. The others were packing their belongings and preparing to leave, but Amara's mind was elsewhere. It doesn't feel right, she said suddenly. The others looked at her. What doesn't feel right? Ifoma asked, zipping up her trousers. Leaving here without seeing the forbidden forest, Amara replied, her voice low and firm. The others exchanged uneasy glances. But we promised not to go there, said Adaze, one of the corpers. Amara smiled faintly. We've been here for a year. We've followed every rule, done everything right. Don't you want to see if the stories are true, just for ourselves? No one has to know. The others hesitated, but Amara's words were tempting. Finally, they nodded reluctantly. Fine, Ifoma said, but how will we find the way? That evening, they called Ninkem, the little girl with the sharp eyes and quick tongue. She stood before them, clutching her doll, her face serious. The doll, handmade with straw and fabric scraps, had one button eye and a faint smile sewn onto its face. And Kem held it tightly, as though drawing courage from it. And Kem held it tightly. We need your help. The little girl frowned, her brows knitting together. Help with what? We want to know the way to the forest, Amara said, her voice soft and careful. Menkem's eyes widened, and she shook her head quickly, her braids swaying like little ropes. No, you can't go there. It's dangerous. We won't go far, Amara assured her. We just want to look. It'll be our secret. The villagers will never know. She handed Ninkem a small bracelet as a gift. The bracelet sparkled faintly in the dim light, its glass beads catching the last rays of the setting sun. Enkem stared at the bracelet, then at the corpers. Her little heart wavered. Finally, she sighed, her voice barely above a whisper. Okay, she said, but you have to promise you'll come back before it's dark. We promise, Amara said, smiling. Kem described the path to the forest in detail, her voice trembling. Her small finger pointed toward the eastern side of the village, where the trees grew taller and darker. When she finished, she looked at them one last time, her lips trembling. Please don't go too far, she begged, clutching her doll tighter. The next day, at the hottest part of the afternoon, when most of the villagers were resting, 3 of the corpers slipped away. The sun beat down mercilessly, and the air buzzed with the sound of cicadas. They laughed quietly as they walked, teasing the villagers in their minds. They've scared themselves with stories, Amara said, shaking her head. This is going to be nothing. As they entered the forest, it was like stepping into another world. The air was cooler, and the trees were tall and thick, their leaves shimmering with strange colors. A faint mist hung in the air, giving the place an ethereal glow. Flowers of every shade bloomed, and the ground sparkled as if sprinkled with stars. Somewhere in the distance, a faint rustling could be heard, like whispers carried by the wind. This is beautiful, Adaze whispered, her eyes wide, taking in the surreal landscape. But as they ventured deeper, the magic began to fade. The trees grew darker, their branches twisting like claws. The air became heavy, and the once sweet scent turned sour, like rotting fruit. Does anyone else feel strange? Yvonne asked, her voice shaky. Her fingers played nervously with the edge of her scarf. Amara waved her hand dismissively, though her own steps slowed. It's just your mind playing tricks. Let's keep going. They walked on, unaware that the forest was watching them, its silence growing more oppressive with every step. Even the birds stopped singing, and the wind felt like it was holding its breath. The corpers moved slowly now, their laughter replaced by uneasy whispers. I don't like this, Adaze said, clutching her scarf tightly, as if it could shield her from the creeping dread. Amara rolled her eyes, though her own heart was beating faster. We're just scaring ourselves, she muttered. But then a sharp scream tore through the silence. It was Ifoma. She was pointing ahead, her hand trembling like a leaf in the wind. Look, she cried, her voice cracking. The others followed her gaze, and their blood ran cold. In the distance was a figure, a man walking slowly. But something was terribly wrong. He had no head. His shoulders moved as if he was breathing, but his neck ended in nothingness. The corpers froze, their breath caught in their throats. The man without his head kept walking. His steps were slow and steady, like he was searching for something or someone. Run, Amara, shouted, her voice breaking the spell of fear. They turned to flee, but as they did, a wall appeared out of nowhere. It was tall, black, and smooth, stretching as far as their eyes could see. Its surface shimmered faintly, as though it wasn't entirely solid. Where did this come from? Adeze screamed, pounding on the wall with her fists. We're trapped, Ifoma cried, her knees buckling. Before they could gather their thoughts, strange creatures began to emerge from the shadows. Their eyes glowed red, their shapes twisting and shifting like smoke. Some looked like animals, others like humans, but none of them were natural. A low growling sound filled the air, making the ground vibrate beneath their feet. The corpers clung to each other, their fear spilling out in choked sobs. One of the women fell to the ground, her body shaking. Another stood frozen, unable to move or speak. We shouldn't have come, Amara whispered, her voice barely audible. Her confidence was gone, replaced by sheer terror. The creatures circled them, their glowing eyes fixed on the intruders. The forest seemed alive, its trees leaning closer, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. For the first time, the corpers understood the truth. This was no ordinary place. This was a world they were never meant to enter, and now it was too late to turn back. Back in Oreo village, the day turned strange. The sky, once bright and blue, grew dark as though a giant hand had smeared it with ashes. A fierce wind howled through the trees, rattling windows and tearing leaves from their branches. The scent of rain hung in the air, though no clouds threatened a storm. Villagers stopped in their tracks, their hearts heavy with unease. Chickens clucked nervously, and goats bleated as if sensing danger. Something is wrong, an elder murmured, gripping his staff tightly. His eyes scanned the horizon, but there was no sign of what had disturbed the balance. The chief priest, a man with a face as old as time, hurried to the palace, his beads clinking with each step. He burst into the king's chamber, his voice urgent. Your Majesty, the forest gods are angry. Something terrible has happened. The king frowned deeply, his heart sinking. He had lived long enough to know that when the forest stirred, disaster was near. Outside, the wind carried an eerie sound, like distant cries woven into its howl. What must we do? The king asked, his voice heavy with worry. The priest shook his head, his face grim. We must act quickly. If we don't appease them, the whole village will suffer. Meanwhile, deep in the forest, Amara and her friends were running like haunted animals. The creatures they had seen earlier were gone, but the forest felt alive, watching their every move. The path they had entered was gone, replaced by endless trees and twisted roots. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the faint sound of whispers seemed to follow them. Every time they thought they found a way out, they suddenly found themselves deeper in the forest. We need to find the way out, Amara said, her voice trembling as she glanced over her shoulder. Suddenly, Adeye screamed. She had stepped on loose ground and tumbled into a deep, abandoned well. Her cry echoed as she hit the bottom, her voice breaking with pain. Help me, Adeye shouted, her voice filled with terror. The others rushed to the edge, their faces pale. The well was lined with mossy stones, and its bottom seemed impossibly far in the dim light. They tried to pull her up, but the well was deep and their hands were weak from fear and exhaustion. We can't leave her there, Ifoma sobbed. tears streaming down her face. Amara bit her lip, her mind racing, but the forest offered no mercy. That the forest offered no mercy. The air grew colder, the shadows darker. A low hum filled the air, like the deep breath of something vast and ancient. I don't know what to do, Amara admitted, her voice cracking. They were lost, their phones useless, their voices swallowed by the forest. Every direction looked the same trees stretching endlessly, their branches twisting like bony fingers. As night began to fall, the reality of their mistake sank in. The corpers huddled together, their faces pale with regret. In their hearts they knew the truth. The forest wasn't just angry, it wanted to keep them forever. Back in the village, chaos erupted. The wind howled like a wild animal, and the sky churned with dark clouds. Villagers screamed as strange figures began to appear, headless men wandering the streets, their footsteps slow but deliberate. Masquerades with long canes roamed the village, striking the ground as if calling for blood. The chief priest worked tirelessly in the palace, chanting and making sacrifices. He slaughtered a goat, then a rooster, but the gods remained silent. The wind grew stronger, shaking the very walls of the palace. This is beyond ordinary anger, the priest told the king. The forest gods demand justice. Just then, Kem, the little girl who had helped the corpers, ran into the palace, her face pale with fear. Her doll hung limply in her hand, and her usually lively eyes were wide and teary. Your Majesty, she cried, falling to her knees. Her hands trembled as she clutched the hem of her wrapper, her tears soaking into the dirt floor of the palace. The king leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with concern. What is it, child? Speak. Nenkem's voice cracked as she confessed. The corpers. They asked me for the way to the forest. I told them. Gasps filled the room. The elders stared at Nankem, their faces a mix of shock and anger. One elder dropped his staff, the sound echoing in the heavy silence. You did what one elder shouted, his voice shaking with fury. I didn't know they would go, and Kem sobbed. They promised not to. They promised not to. They said it was just a secret. The king's face darkened, but he held up his hand to silence the room. We cannot waste time, he said firmly. We must save them before it's too late. The chief priest nodded, his beaded staff clinking softly. The gods demand their return. If they die in the forest, the curse will spread to us all. The villagers, though angry, set their emotions aside. Torches were lit, their flames flickering as the night wind whispered ominously. Preparations were made quickly, with the women chanting soft prayers as they handed supplies to the search party. The chief priest led the way, chanting as they marched toward the edge of the forest. They knew they were racing against time, for the wrath of the forest would only grow stronger with each passing moment. Deep inside the forest, Amara and her friends were running, their footsteps echoing like whispers through the trees. The creatures they had seen earlier were gone, but the forest still felt alive, watching their every move. The path they had entered had disappeared, replaced by endless trees and twisting roots that seemed to shift underfoot. We can't stay here, Ifoma cried, clutching her side. Her voice trembled, her breath coming in sharp gasps. The faint sound of rushing water nearby added to the tension, reminding them how far they were from safety. I'm trying to think, Amara snapped, though her own fear was evident in her shaking hands. Suddenly, Adaese's voice echoed faintly from the well. Help me, please. Her cries grew weaker with each passing moment. Amara and the others stumbled back to the edge of the well, peering into its dark depths. The smell of damp earth and decay rose to meet them. Hold on, Adeze, Amara said, her voice shaky. We'll get you out. But the forest seemed to have other plans. The air grew colder, and the trees seemed to lean closer, their branches creaking like warning whispers. An owl hooted in the distance, the sound chilling in the unnatural silence. Back in Oreo village, the villagers were making their way to the forest's edge. The chief priest led the procession, his chants echoing into the darkening sky. The wind howled, tugging at their torches, and the air was thick with dread. They must still be alive, the priest said, his voice resolute. The gods are waiting for us to act. As the villagers approached the forest, the ground trembled beneath their feet. The priest paused, raising his hands. Spirits of the forest, he called out, we come to beg for mercy. Return our children to us. The forest groaned in response, its shadows shifting like restless spirits. The villagers exchanged uneasy glances but pressed on. In the forest, the corpers were reaching their breaking point. Exhausted and terrified, they clung to one another for support. Ifoma sank to the ground, tears streaming down her face. We're not getting out of here, she whispered. Don't say that, Amara barked, though her voice wavered. We can't give up. Suddenly, the sound of movement made them freeze. Twigs snapped and leaves rustled. They turned, their hearts pounding. From the shadows emerged a creature unlike anything they had ever seen. Its eyes glowed a piercing red, and its form shifted between human and beast. It let out a low growl, the sound reverberating through their very bones. Run, Amara screamed, pulling Ifoma to her feet. They bolted, stumbling over roots and branches as the creature pursued them. The forest seemed to close in, the trees forming a labyrinth that twisted and turned with every step. As they ran, they found themselves back at the well. Adaese's cries had stopped, and an eerie silence hung in the air. Adaese, Amara called desperately, but there was no response. The ground beneath their feet began to shift. The corpus screamed as roots rose from the earth, wrapping around their ankles and dragging them toward the well. The creature watched, its red eyes gleaming with malice. At the forest's edge, the villagers could feel the forest's fury. The chief priest raised his hands, his chants growing louder. Spirits of the forest, we offer this sacrifice in exchange for their lives. He held up a bowl filled with blood from the animals they had slaughtered. The villagers knelt, their heads bowed in prayer. The forest groaned, and the wind howled fiercely. Then suddenly it stopped. The silence was deafening. A faint light appeared within the forest, flickering like a distant flame. The priest's eyes widened. They are alive, he whispered. The gods are giving us one last chance. Amara and her friends woke to find themselves lying at the edge of the forest, their bodies battered and bruised. The villagers surrounded them, their faces filled with relief and fear. You're alive, the king said, his voice heavy with emotion. The chief priest stepped forward, his expression grave. But the gods are not pleased. You have angered them, and the price must be paid. The Corpers exchanged frightened glances. "What price?" Ifoma asked, her voice trembling. The priest sighed. "You are marked if you leave this village. You were marked if you leave this village. You will die. The spirits will not let you go." The Corpers' relief turned to despair. Their dreams of returning to the city, to their families and old lives, were shattered. "Please," Amara begged, tears streaming down her face. "We didn't mean any harm. We were just curious." The priest shook his head. "Curiosity is what angered the gods. You broke the rule, and now the rule binds you." The villagers cared for the Corpers, bringing them food and tending to their wounds, but the women's lives would never be the same. Amara, once bold and confident, now moved quietly, her legs broken and lifeless. Ifoma, who had lost her arm in the chaos, stared at the empty space where it used to be, her heart heavy with regret. Adaze bore deep scars, her once bright spirit dimmed. The story of the Corpers and the Forbidden Forest became a lesson passed down through generations. Parents warned their children, "Disobedience brings suffering. Some rules are not meant to be broken." The Corpers stayed in Oreo village, their fates tied to the land they had come to serve. They watched the seasons change, their dreams of freedom replaced by the reality of their punishment. And the forest, silent and watchful, remained untouched, its secrets hidden from those who dared to dream of uncovering them. Curiosity can lead to discovery, but it can also lead to consequences we're not prepared for, just like the Corpers who ventured into the forbidden forest. Their story serves as a timeless reminder that some boundaries are meant to protect, not to confine. As we explore the unknown in life, let's remember to respect the wisdom of those before us. Thank you for joining me today. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that make you think